All right. How's it growing, friends? Welcome to Office Hours, your source for free cannabis cultivation education. I'm Keisha, and I'm one of your moderators. Happy Thursday, Mandy.
Hello, my co-moderator, Keisha, and hello, everyone. We're here for episode 70. Wow, can you believe it? We're also going live over on YouTube, so if you're logging on over there, make sure you send us your questions, and I'll get those to the team. I'm here to remind you also, if you're active on social media, be sure you're following us on all the platforms. So we're on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Social Club. But all right, you guys, let's do this. We got a ton of crop steering questions this week, so let's get right into it. Back over to you, Keisha.
Thank you, Mandy. All right. If you're live with us here and you have a question, type it in the chat at any time. And if your question gets picked, we'll have you either unmute yourself or one of us will ask for you. Seth and Jason are in the house. Gentlemen, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
Yeah, good.
It's a beautiful day out. Can't ask for much more.
Yeah, same. I know. So grateful. Happy summer, y'all. That's right. It's officially summer. All right. You ready for our first question? We got a lot. This one came in. We didn't get to it last week, but I want to know the answer to this question. Scaff was wondering, what are the benefits of having an oscillating fan blowing on your plants?
Airflow?
Yeah, I mean, we want to keep fresh air moving around the room. I mean, obviously, we've got gas exchange going on. We want to get, all that oxygen that's being produced out of the canopy and move it out and replace it with CO2. And then also that airflow strongly affects leaf surface temp and the VPD right around the leaf surface. So that's, at the end of the day, everything we do in the environment is really targeting optimal conditions in that first few millimeters around the plant surface. So that's what we're looking at. Airflow can massively change that. That's how we can take a plant that's got a leaf surface temp that's plus 5 degrees over ambient room temp and bring it back down into a reasonable range and also promote good transpiration.
Well, another reason as well is, try and get uniformity in the air temperature of the room. So typically, in one corner, we might have an HVAC system. We need to make sure that air gets dispersed throughout the room. That being said, other than oscillating fans, I really like HVAC socks. They're one of my favorite ways to get good air movement throughout the room, disperse the temperature of AC or heating air. And, they don't push too hard on the plants as well. So you don't have to worry about like fan burn if your plants are getting pretty close to the air socks.
Yeah, I mean, a good way to look at it is if you've got any source of air movement, whether it's a fan, a vent register coming in, anything like that, you can put your hand in front of it and walk away. You pretty quickly see a diminishing amount of airflow going across your hand. If you can use a sock to help direct that airflow in the appropriate places, we've seen people using both overhead and underneath the benches from time to time to push airflow around to the right place. And it actually becomes really important when you've got a very big room. If we're in a 400 square foot flower room that's not very big, we can actually get some good air movement with just regular oscillating fans or lift fans. But once it gets bigger, we want to try to work as hard as possible to eliminate any of those microclimate situations there. And the oscillating fans are a great start, really, especially for a small space and where you have enough access to put them evenly distributed. And if they blow far enough in, you're going to get some good air movement.
Excellent, y'all. Already blowing minds. All right. Con and popping on YouTube already. What's happening, Mandy?
Thanks, Keisha. Yeah, Poppy Grows has a question about high pH. I'm growing in 1 gallon pots with 6.0 pH. My res is at 2.7 EC, and my Teros reads 4.8 to 8 in between feeds. Dryback overnight hits 11 to 12 EC. Runoff EC is at 5.6 pH. Let's see, is it way too high? Do we have some advice about pH in this situation?
I mean, it sounds like he's getting pretty good results, honestly, with cocoa watering in at that 5.9 to 6.0 is pretty standard. And we actually do want to see a small drop in that EC when it comes out in terms of runoff. Especially if you're getting proper runoff, you're not having any channeling or anything going on. That's telling us that the plant is pulling nutrients out, which, we've discussed this before. Basically, you're pulling negative ions out of solution. The more positive ions you have, the lower the pH is. So basically, if your pH was coming out higher and we're seeing bad plant health, we would go ahead and say, hey, this plant is having problems uptaking these nutrients. But because we're putting it in at an appropriate pH and pulling it out at an appropriate pH, we know that the root zone pH is stable in the range that we want it to be.
keep doing what you're
I
doing.
didn't want to trip everything.
Yeah. Don't question yourself too much. And, also remember, guys, like sometimes, when you drift a little bit outside of these norms, like we always say 5.6 to 6.0 is a sweet spot. And that's just because that's where you get optimal uptake of all the plant nutrients we want and the right amount of restriction on things like nitrogen that are pulling up. Drifting outside of that range a little bit isn't a huge reason for concern. Like everything, we're always playing a game of averages here. If we took runoff from every plant across the whole table, some might be 5.6, some might be 5.7, some might be 5.4. What we want to see is a stable trend in close to that range. If we're seeing a downward trend, we're going to run into some severe plant nutrition issues because the plant's basically deficient of everything at that point. And then same on the other end. When you go too high in pH, the plant can't take up nutrients in appropriate fashion. So that's why we're really targeting that 5.6 to 6.0. And yeah, just keep rolling. Watch it to make sure you don't go too far outside the range, and then recognize that like if your pH is drifting down, the plant's pulling out, negative ions. It's pulling food out of solution. So, number one, that's a good thing. Number two, we always want to balance that pH because again, if it goes too low, we're going to have some severe plant health issues. So really keep an eye on that. And then, keep doing what you're doing. Sounds like you're pushing the right amount of runoff. You're not letting things get too stagnant in there. I would just keep on rocking like you are.
Yeah. If you want more resources on, specifically what the nutrient solubility is at different pHs, Google search nutrient solubility pH chart. And there's going to be different charts for different types of media. It's just kind of a great way to get a visual on where the different macro and micronutrients are most available to the plant.
Yeah. And, if you're, especially because you're already taking, actual substrate data readings, like even if you're not using a time series graph, but you do have access to time series data and real numbers from the root zone, you can also start to determine whether you actually have a high EC lockout situation, a low or high pH situation that's causing the plant to not uptake nutrients. You can really navigate those waters of what the heck is going on with my plant with a little more clarity, because you can kind of eliminate certain problems just by knowing, like, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who are really concerned that their EC is getting super high. We have to say, hey, no, it really isn't compared to everything we see out there. But what's your pH doing? And if their runoff pH is at 5.2, no amount of over or under fertilizing is going to fix that. We've got to solve that pH problem to get the plant back into a zone where it can uptake nutrients.
That's great advice. Poppy Grows did come back with a little bit more information. Basically, my question is, why is my pH hitting 10 and up, but my plants are still healthy? You guys have any advice?
pH is hitting 10?
pH or EC?
It says pH.
I would calibrate my pH meter.
Yeah, I was gonna say
that's
if we're that high, we'll definitely see some deficiencies going on in the plant very quickly.
If the pH was 10, you could stick your finger in that runoff and get burnt. Kill the first few layers of cells on your finger skin. So I would really look at calibrating that. For reference, the higher end pH meters that like Jason and I like to use as reference points, you calibrate every single time you use them, even if that's 10 times a day. With set standard solutions that you can rely on.
And if you don't have a high-end pH meter, it's worth investing in one.
Absolutely. And at the bare minimum, do your redundant checks, get a good standard solution, do a multi-point calibration, not a single point. And then, those little paper strips, as old school tech as they are always pretty nice if you find yourself with an unbelievable number. It's kind of same thing. We'll see like some outrageous EC numbers. Like, is that thing really 30? And then we go look at it and there's actually just a different problem with the sensor where it hasn't been cleaned and it has salt buildup all over it. So anytime it gets wet at all, it's reading a really high reading.
The good old litmus paper.
Yep. Yeah.
Walmart I remember has those.
Yeah. You can
get
it for
class.
Aquariums. Yeah. They're awesome. Everywhere. They're very available, and it's not quite as precise. It depends. I mean, if you're color blind, that's going to be a rough one for you. But otherwise, they're a good mark to see if you're close at all. Because I know myself, I've chased several problems that just turned out to be a bad reading. We're looking at a lot of different sensors to control everything in these systems, and Once you've got like, let's say 4 pH pens running around in a facility and each person owns that, but not everyone's calibrating every day. Well, now we're all disagreeing about who's mixing their tanks correctly. So it's important to make sure everyone's on the same standard when it comes to units of measurement.
I have a kind of a fun anecdote back when we were growing. I was working on looking at my climate systems, doing some HVAC modifications in the greenhouse. And I noticed that, hey, my light levels are super low. And ended up going in the greenhouse and someone had put the climate station on its side. So the light sensor was, they said 90 degrees off. And I was like, oh, okay, nothing to fix here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh. It's like something that you don't even think about, but yeah, calibrate those sensors, growers. We are getting so many questions over on YouTube. So I'm going to go on to this question from John. For home growers, John wants to know, for home growers using LEDs and no supplemental CO2, is there a standard PPFD number or formula that we should shoot for at the various stages of grow? So example, PPFD in early veg, flower, late flower. What do you guys think?
I mean, I personally, if you're using LEDs and you don't have CO2, you probably don't have a huge operation. Probably don't have a lot of overhead cost into lights. I would run them pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, the tough thing is, we got to look at your ambient CO2. Depending on where you live, that can vary a little bit. And depending on what's going on in your house, that can vary a little bit. You can run them fairly high. Personally, what I do, since I'm not supplementing CO2 in my home, is I mount my big LEDs way up at the ceiling. And then I can just adjust intensity a little bit while they're growing because I'm so overlit for the amount of CO2 that I have that, if I crack over 800 ppfd at the canopy, I'm passing that point of diminishing returns. I'm just not seeing a lot of yield or quality increases. And because it's LED, I'm not necessarily torching the tops of my plants. That leaf surface temp isn't getting so high that it's putting that plant into drought stress mode. We're just wasting photons at that point. So I call it at about 800 ppfd at the canopy. You're not going to see a whole lot of benefit above that. And if, really accurate CO2 sensors are quite expensive. So if you are looking at a home grow, I would probably count on about a, 300 to 500 ppm baseline of CO2 in your ambient environment. And then, top that on the fact, like, do you have what is your space? Do you have a tent in a sealed room? How often are you exchanging that air so you're not just running out of CO2 during the daytime? Because that's a very easy thing to do. If you just seal up a room and have no CO2 input, you're going to slowly ride that ppm line down over the days. So
in a home grow, how do we get more CO2 for like free? We get more pets or have more parties?
Yeah, breathe. And then there's a bunch of products out there that home growers can use, usually like inoculated grain bags for different types of mushrooms and things like that to increase CO2 in your little home grow tent or room. Personally, I've always wanted to play with brewing in a room roughly the same area as my plants are. That way I can circulate air and exchange it. Because CO2 systems are spendy. And if you do happen to be growing in a building that's habitated, you don't always want to run a risk of just pumping your CO2 up to like 10,000 ppm in the house and not necessarily waking up in the right state of mind.
Hey, that would be a cool experiment though, brewing beer in your grow.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's several companies out there that do sell the mushroom inoculation bags. I mean, you can grow edible mushrooms inside of your little cannabis grow if you want to.
We could do aquaponics and brewing. Get some tilapia and beer, some bud.
Maybe not make the beer with the tilapia water.
Mutualism at its finest. Awesome. Thanks for that, guys. Andreas has a question. Will a high EC in bulking, for example, an average of 7 to 8 EC with a 9-hour irrigation window, cause early ripening in the end of week 5? Thanks. Love the show.
For most strains, probably not. I mean, that's still within a reasonable range that I don't mind being during your bulking stages. So you might see certain strains not like to be up there. You just got to take notes on how they perform when they finish up and document it all.
Yeah. And, a big thing to look at, I mean, that crop registration and time series data is insanely important when we're talking about EC building, because if we're looking at bulking being in a 6 to a 9 range, what's really going to dictate whether that's appropriate is how your buildup was to that point. If we only ever hit a 4 to a 5 range in generative, and then suddenly we're trying to really stack it up in bulking, that might give us some unwanted stress. We want to have our baseline for EC set by the time we roll into bulking. Otherwise, usually we're looking at other cues to really help those plants finish up. Once you go to 12-12, they're on a determinate timeline. So they've got X amount of days that the plants wants to go. And it's not necessarily just days. We're looking at, energy inputs and overall basic goals in plant development. But usually, something environmental, something I always like to check just because I tend to struggle with this from time to time. Go check your drippers. Sometimes when I look out and I see some plants that look like they're trying to finish early, I'll go find that, whoa, this one's only been getting about 60% of the water that I put on everything else. And I'm subjecting it to the same environment. So it's kind of behind, maybe developmentally, or advanced because it's trying to cope with that little bit of drought stress that you're throwing at it compared to everything else.
Yeah. And if we need to, bring our EC down just a little bit, get a tad bit more runoff, either increase your P2s slightly or just try to get a little bit more runoff when we hit field capacity in our P1.
Absolutely. And, it always goes back to crop registration when you're trying to relate your EC changes to your runoff amounts. So always write that down. And then, excuse me, as you do it more and more, eventually it becomes fairly intuitive to go, okay, with my setup, I push, I add 40 seconds to an irrigation cycle. I know that that's going to give me, let's say 35 seconds of runoff based on what I had before. And now that I've done this 100 times over, I can usually predict how much EC drop I'm going to see after that runoff event, or if that's going to be what it takes for me to maintain and not raise or lower.
Awesome. Solid advice, y'all. Let us know if you have any follow-up questions. Lou has a question and it's a little bit long, so bear with me, you guys, as I get through all of this information. Would you recommend a freshwater reset once a week when irrigating for desired drybacks while not pushing runoff in order to help regulate pH? Do you recommend pushing more amount of runoff each irrigation event and allow for an increased dryback period to allow pots to go from 60 to 65 reading down to desired water content? We have found an irrigation strategy of one large P1 shot during stretch, up to 3 P1 shots in bulk, back to one large P1 shot during ending generative with no P2 other than emergency shots works for us. Basically, increase runoff to regulate pH and increase longer dryback time, or limit runoff during the week and do a freshwater flush once a week to regulate root zone pH. Dude, I did it.
Yeah. Sounds like we've got kind of two questions in that one. First off, the question was freshwater flush, and then the second question would have been irrigation strategies. So let's hit the first question real quick. And my answer is going to be, I don't like to do that. If I need to regulate my pH, then usually I'll just try and find what the cause of my pH issues are. Is it a nutrient imbalance? Is the nutrient composition not appropriate for what that plant is eating? And to address that, we can always send in for leaf tissue analysis, and that'll give us an idea of what nutrients are high in concentration in the plant. If it's not that big of an issue, then let's just push slightly more runoff with our standard fertigation units. We'll be 3 to 4 EC typically, and just run that and see if that helps correct your pH problem. But as always, any type of fresh water, no nutrient levels, those are going to drastically affect what our salt concentration in the block is, what our nutrient concentration is. And we don't want that to change drastically fast. That's going to cause some issues as far as how the osmotic potential, what those plants are used to. They get accustomed to the amount of nutrients in the block, and we don't want to change that really quickly. Obviously, we can alter it over time when we're stacking or when we're doing some ripening. And answer is no.
Yeah, don't. I'll agree with that. If you're finding yourself feeling like you need to reset with my strong guess would be if you're trying to maintain pH, you're resetting with pH 6.5 fresh water with no salt in it. That's a Band-Aid situation. When we're watching that EC creep up, there's two things. One, we're putting osmotic stress on the plant, and the other one is we want to think about what the composition of that EC is. So if I'm getting runoff and that pH is creeping down, that means my nutritional balance is off. So even though my EC is high, it doesn't have the EC doesn't have the salt that I actually want in the block. And that's where pushing more runoff and, it kind of seems counterintuitive sometimes, but actually running a little bit higher feed EC. So, just like Jason said, running between a 3 and a 4, it's over the years, we've seen this baseline feed EC creep up from back in the day at 1.8, 2.0, 2.5, 2.7. Now we're creeping up to 3.0. And, a long time ago, it would have been crazy to feed that high. But now we're kind of discovering once we take control of plant nutrition and we're really controlling everything going on in the substrate, sometimes feeding more of the ions we want into the block so that we can push out some of the ones we don't want is a better solution than just chasing the higher EC. And a good thing to remember is we're always looking at that EC baseline. Like if during my dry back, I see that EC creeping very high, again, if my pH is off, that's not the EC I want. So I want to make sure that it's a good balanced approach. And again, if you're pushing that freshwater push to try to maintain pH, I would guess you really need to push a little more runoff, maybe up that feed EC. And yeah, just keep an eye on your runoff pH. I would any day rather save my pH than try to push higher EC as my pH is creeping down. I want to keep that plant in a healthy zone and then understand that if it's week 3 of stretch and I haven't hit the EC goals that I wanted to, if I wanted to be at a 6 to 11 and I made it to a 4 to 8, it's going to be better for plant health to maintain pH and stay in that lower EC. And then next round, come back and go look at it holistically and say, hey, what was my stack looking like? And where was it? And that's where, again, crop registration, runoff notes, having as much of a picture. So when you look back and say, hey, we're pushing too much runoff for our first week and a half, we need to kind of dial our irrigation strategy to be lighter during that time so we can build it up steadily, not just have it flush out till the plants get big enough that we're actually not getting as much runoff.
That's a great point as far as, trying to just adjust your EC in order to do that. Anytime that we're underfeeding the plant, pH is going to be really hard to control. Obviously, with good nutrient balance, we're always trying to have the right amounts of each nutrient in solution that are being fed to the plant. If we're underfeeding, a lot of times it's going to run out of one of the specific nutrients that it prefers. And that's a lot of times going to show up as a deficiency in the plant and hard to control pH.
Yeah. And if you're new to using things like decisiemens to look at EC rather than just ppm, understanding that with the systems we're using and with this level of control that we, not just Arroyo, but in general has been introduced into horticulture, we are pushing these plants a lot harder and discovering that our baseline ECs can be a lot higher than a lot of growing tech 10 years ago would have told us, and that's just because we'll always say cannabis is pushing the envelope. It's a high value, high performance crop. We're looking to get the most out of it and not terribly worried about inputs. Everyone has a budget, but like cannabis farmers are generally willing to up their inputs, up the cost going in to get a higher quality and higher yielding product out of the other side. Whereas if I'm in the wheat field just outside of this building, I'm looking at what's the minimum I can put in to get an acceptable yield.
Yeah, well, let's hit the second part of that question. As far as sounded like through generative stacking, doing 1P1, through bulking 3 P1s. So it sounds like maybe some of the strains that you're running are more vegetative leaning type of strains, and that's what they might prefer. So it's going to kind of come down to how far are we leaning on that spectrum. And so overall, your crop steering strategy is going to be slightly more generative throughout the entire cycle. And so it might be a good strategy. I personally, even if I'm just doing, 1 hour irrigation window for P1s, I like to have multiple shots to allow the capillary effect of that substrate to catch up with my irrigations. And that way I'm getting up to field capacity before I'm getting any runoff, and I'm not wasting any fertigation solution.
Yeah. Another thing to consider too, if that's how few irrigations you are putting on and you're actually able to put on that 1P1 without a massive amount of channeling, that would kind of lead me to think that you're using a fairly large size media in like the 2 gallon plus range. And anytime we get to that point, especially with different cocoa mixes, we do have a small amount of cation exchange capacity that comes into play. So basically that cocoa can hold a small amount of ions, but the more cocoa you have, the more it can hold physically. So at that point, if we've got, say, a 15% dryback on a 2-gallon pot, where we might have a 30% dryback with the same size plant on a 3-gallon pot, I now have less control because I have less opportunity to pull that lever called irrigation and adjust the EC and pH in that root zone. I don't have as many shots or as much volume to really flush that out and reset that balance. So, I mean, that's part of why we're seeing too, with hydroponic systems in general, a kind of a drift over the years towards a smaller and smaller media size. I mean, personally, I get the same size plant out of a 1-gallon cocoa pot that I used to get out of a 3.5, well, bigger than I used to get out of a 3.5-gallon cocoa pot, 6 years ago or so. So that's definitely something to look at as well. If you've got this big battery that's being charged up by all these ions and it just can't, you can't fully discharge enough of it to get a good charge back into it, that's something to consider.
The old irrigation lever, huh?
Yeah, pull it. See what happens.
Great crop steering advice, y'all. Thanks for covering those questions. And yeah, Lou, let us know if you have any follow-up. We're still getting questions over on YouTube, so I'm going to get to this one from Poppy Grows. So just curious, assuming my readings were all correct, because everything else seems to have been where they should have been, if my pH is coming in at that high 9 above, so high 9 region, what do you suggest and why would my plants still be so healthy? I'm looking at it, just basically this thing has them worried about pH runoff, and they've been monitoring it for a few days and it doesn't change. Do you have any advice for them?
pH coming in at 9, or we like
that's what you're reading in the pH, I'm thinking, or in the runoff samples.
Oh, gotcha.
pH runoff, yes.
Gotcha. Yeah, I would be slightly concerned about that. I would certainly watch plant health and probably not try to push the EC levels too high. Again, I would really invest in probably an alternative sensor. That's pretty unlikely. And then the next thing to look at is your substrate composition. Are you running straight cocoa? Do you have some amendments in there? And if you're running organics and a lot of biology in there, we're looking at a whole different host of interactions than standard runoff EC and pHs. So that's also something to consider. If you've got a lot of calcium carbonate in there or some other buffer, that used to be a pretty standard thing to mix a few different types of calcium and other, carbonates for high pH into your cocoa to have some kind of buffering. A lot of times home growers, especially back in the day, didn't have a pH pen. So the way to deal with that was to buffer your media. If you're following a mixing tech that has some of that going on, but now you're actually pHing your input water and not putting in, let's say, a 4.8 pH salt mix with tap water that you have unmonitored and you need buffering capacity for, if you're putting that incorrect, that buffering may be upping that. And I'm not sure that's for sure what's going on, but that's definitely another thing to look into, especially outside of commercial production. I know it's really popular to kind of implement your own mix. You might get some raw cocoa and add some biochar, some limestone, some azomite, various different minerals to help buffer. And while that is useful, it can throw off some of these smaller readings. And that's part of why we look at using, basically straight cocoa or rock wool on a commercial level, because we're eliminating variables.
Yeah. And, like in most any soilless hydro system that I've worked in, if I get over 6.5, if I'm creeping up towards 7 for pH, I'm going to see that in the plants pretty quickly. So I would definitely investigate further to see what's going on there.
Absolutely. I wish I had a solid answer for you, buddy, but there's a few spots that it definitely could be. And I just kind of start eliminating any of those possibilities one by one.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Poppy Grows came back with, my Gromy is on the way. I think that means homie who grows. I love that term. That's new to me. Is on the way with his sensors to check out what you said. Also, so I'm hoping it's my meter, like you said. Awesome. Thanks for that question, Poppy Grows. Good to see you again. We had another question. Lou came back with a couple more pieces of clarification. We do use 2-gallon pots, and we actually have not seen any channeling. pH is coming back way lower than feed pH. is it a bad practice to have to wait longer than 24 hours between irrigation events in systems that steer fairly heavy generative cues?
I like to have a media size that allows me to irrigate every day. These plants they're cyclical. When we train them to start drinking after lights come on, we want to train them that every day. And that's kind of really what's going to give us the ability to do crop steering, is the fact that we're in a sized media that allows us to control what type of irrigations are affecting that plant that day.
Yeah. And, a common thing I see if people are struggling with some of these pH issues, especially if they're comfortable with their plant size and you're already at so few irrigations that we're talking about going, a whole day without irrigating and riding it out. Switching to like a 1 gallon pot might actually make your life a lot easier, because now that you can water every day, you have the opportunity to reset that ionic balance. So if I've got, again, a 1 gallon pot and I'm replacing 30% of that volume, that's going to have a bigger effect on what's going on in that media than if I have a 2 gallon pot and I'm replacing 10 to 15% of it. I want to be able to take advantage of every day to control what's going on in that substrate. And the bigger dryback we have, also the more opportunity we have to put input water in and affect, what's going on in that root zone. So really balancing that plant and pot size sometimes is one of the easiest ways to overcome this kind of challenge. And, if we weren't, and if we look back, go back a few years, that's where some of these techs come in, right? Like we're using a media that has some CEC, we're watering with feed every other day or 3 days in a row, then taking a day or two off, or some combination of putting salts on, expecting them to remain in the media, and then putting water on to re-wet it. And what we're trying to do is have a much greater level of control than doing that.
Awesome. It's all about getting more control. I think that's it for the questions on YouTube for now. So I'm going to pass it to Keisha for our Instagram questions.
Thanks, Grow Me. Hobby Grows. Appreciate you bringing that gift into my life. Okay. So it seems like pH is the theme of the show. I'm going to go ahead and bring this question here. Dave is having issues with low runoff pH. He writes, around week 6, I'm getting runoff at about 5.0 pH, while my feed pH is usually consistent, 6.1 to 6.2 and 2.5 EC. I'm in 1 gallon cocoa quick fill pots. I usually push a good amount of runoff, 10 to 15% after the P1, and we'll get some runoff as well on the P2 bulking shots. What am I missing here? Still not enough runoff? The environment is on point. I noticed a slight tip burn and it made me check the runoff, which was 5 to 5.2.
Yeah. Interesting one. So it's tip burn, and it took me a while to figure this one out, but a lot of times tip burn is actually not a nutrient excess. It could be a nutrient deficiency. And if we're going in at 2.5, there's a good chance that plant is just eating up all the specific nutrients. And it's pushed that pH down. So I would probably take 2 routes. One, either give it a shot to take your EC up to say 3.0, especially if you're in a well-rounded facility where you've good control on environment, you got CO2, you got good lights. I probably would be always above 3.0 in that time frame. And then the other option would be leaf tissue analysis and get an idea of what nutrients are either in excess or deficiency in that plant.
Yeah, I would really look at that incoming feed EC. A good way to think about it is if we have 2 stacks of positive and negative that are the same size. If one of those, if that total stack pile is, let's say, 10 inches tall or 10 gallons, whatever you want to quantify it as, but if that stack is one size and then, that represents a 2.5 EC, now I make that stack 3 times as big and go up to 7.5. If the plant's pulling out the same amount every day of each stack, when it pulls out of that smaller stack, that's going to affect my pH balance way more quickly than if I have more salt built up in the substrate. So as counterintuitive as it may seem, getting more salt in there might actually be your real solution there. That way, when the plant's eating every day, it's not pulling that ionic balance out of whack nearly as much. And then the irrigation that you give it can be sufficient to replace some of those negative ions and reset that pH balance.
Yeah, and make sure you are getting substrate EC readings. If you don't have a full array system, get a sensor that you can go in there and take a few readings a day. One before irrigation, one right after irrigation, and then one typically towards the end of the day. And just make sure that, hey, I can see that the trend is my plant's eating more nutrients than I'm putting in the substrate.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, even if I'm just using the Solus, if I get my before irrigation, after irrigation, then before lights off, sometimes I'll see that my before irrigation EC has not actually risen that much compared to my feed EC. And if we were to draw a line, that line would be pretty flat and possibly going downward, going down to below feed EC. And if you've been washing a lot with 2.5, running plenty of runoff, you're probably basically rinsing it back to close to 2.5 every day. So your real baseline has never been able to get up high enough to be able to withstand that ionic swing basically throughout the day.
Thank you guys so much. Dave, good luck out there. Keep us posted. All right. The live questions are coming in fast and furious. What's happening on YouTube, Mandy?
Oh my gosh. Thanks for these questions, y'all. Poppy Grows has one. You said to watch my EC inputs. Can you give me some insights into how this affects pH and the relationship?
Yeah. So if we go back to let's just say we're in a deep water culture solution and we've got a certain EC in there. That EC is 3.0. When it goes in, we have it balanced for pH. pH is the negative log of the concentration of positive ions in solution. So as the plant is pulling out the food that it likes to eat, which is primarily negative ions, we're increasing the positive ion concentration. And that increased concentration is what causes pH to go down. So the plant's always pulling those negative ions out, and we're constantly trying to replace that balance. So the only problem is, because of the way ionic salts work, we end up with cations and anions. So the plant's not uptaking those anions. That's what's boosting that pH down, boosting that concentration up. So it's this constant battle we're in where, let's say the plant eats up 1,500 ppms of cations, but we had to put in more than that. Let's say, basically we're leaving anions behind in solution, which is causing that to creep down. That's why I was saying, if you get your EC baseline up higher, that small amount of cations that the plant's taking out is not as impactful to the overall salt concentration inside the block. Whereas if we're at a low concentration, we're changing that ratio in a much more meaningful way to the plant. The difference between 2 and 3 on an EC scale is a lot more impactful than the difference between 9 and 10, let's say, in terms of plant health and pH readings.
Yeah, and I was trying to look up. I think it was Michigan State has a really good article about the different nutrients in solution and how it's affecting your pH. So check out some of the university extensions. They a lot of times break this down into 10-page articles specifying all the different relationships.
Yep, and remember, like I said, going back to the salts, the way ionic salts work, you've got a positive and a negative component. So we don't have a way to transport a lot of these ions or indeed harness them without having this other positive side to it, positively charged side. It's actually a negative for us because it's this whole thing that we got to deal with messing with our pH, right? And that's where, why when we look at a primarily soilless hydroponics or a drain to waste system, that's why, because that runoff is, I don't want to say totally useless to everyone, but we're putting it back into an unbuffered media without, remediating it in any way. We're just going to see that pH creep down over time.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And Poppy Grows says, you guys answered my question. God, I love this show. You guys are amazing. I strive every day to be this smart about the plant. Aw, you guys, they went to school for this. And they have a lot of experience. But yeah, thank you for that. Des Mood had a question. I was running 6 min shots up until 21F, switched to bulk and lowered shots to 4 min, but added 2 maintenance shots, checking the moisture sensor in the morning. They're still drying back the same. Can I go back to 6 min shots and keep the maintenance shots? I know they say smaller shots at this point. What do you guys think?
We just always break it down into P1 and P2 irrigations just to make it easier to talk about. And it sounds like you did change your P1s and then just added more P1s, if you will. a little bit similar to what the guy earlier was talking about, where we're just doing some big irrigations throughout the day. That's not our favorite strategy. That being said, it does work well for certain strains. Typically when I go from generative stacking to vegetative bulking, I'll actually keep the same size P1 and then just add P2 maintenance shots throughout the day.
Yeah. I mean, keep it simple and, look at your actual volumes too. When you're switching from, let's say, several big P1s in generative, and then, what we generally go for is cut your volume in half and double your number of irrigations when you're flipping over into veg for P1. That's a simple way to look at, hey, we know how much dryback volume we need to replace on a daily basis to reach field capacity. And now we're going to maximize shots in that. The next step is, the most difficult way to do this would definitely be with a scale. That would take a lot of time, but go get something like the Solus. And if you want to dial back those P2s in the afternoon, if I had to guess that your dryback is the same size roughly now that you're in bulking as generative, if we looked at that graph, you're going upward. And man, I wish we had a board behind us to draw on this one. But a lot of times once your plant starts uptaking water really fast, you'll be putting on those P2s and it'll feel like you're keeping that moisture content up. But the reality is throughout the day, you're putting the P2s on and that moisture content's continuing to fall in the afternoon. Some of those P2s are actually encouraging the plant to drink more and more essentially and transpire faster, especially if your environment is pretty good. So although if you don't have access to a graph, in time series data, if right now you're thinking you're bringing it up and holding it up at high capacity, like I said, it's probably going down. So you might think that if you were hitting 55% field capacity, that you were at, let's say 48 or 50% at the end of the day. If you don't have a sensor in there and you can't go confirm that, your reality might be, hey, I'm planning on doing all these shots throughout the afternoon, but I'm actually ending my day at a much lower water concentration than I intended on. So I'm getting a pretty equivalent total dryback compared to what was happening in generative.
I'm going to try and show the irrigation curves with my forearms here to indicate what you were talking about. So my left arm is our P1s, and then my right arm is our P2s. So if we're in generative and we don't have any P2s, we're going to be like a peaky mountain, right? Mm-hmm. Here's our irrigation to field capacity, and then here's our dryback the next day. If we have hit field capacity and we have P2s keeping us at field capacity, we're going to be a little bit flat topped until obviously the end of the irrigation. If our P1s aren't getting to field capacity, then sometimes we'll see that actually, irrigation at that top level rise a little bit with P2s. And then the situation that Seth was just describing where our P2s may not be getting back up to field capacity, we're going to be, not always, it's still going to be flat topped, but you're going to have a fairly downward slope in the general trend of water content.
Yep. Your jigsaw is going to be angled pretty sharply. And one thing to remember too, is like when we're talking about those specific graph shapes, that's what is optimal in larger plant populations. When we're talking about bulking, there's more than one way to skin the cat. Let's say you're still, even if you're losing water content in the afternoon, as long as you're putting on those P2s, even if you're putting on 1% P2s and you're losing capacity, you're still effectively bulking the plant. It's just that you might start hitting a point where you're drying back too far, more than is what's safe, and either spiking your EC, or if you're in a lower water content cocoa, you could accidentally start going down below that 20% mark and risking hitting wilting point.
Thanks for that advice. And Jason, thanks for illustrating that. I told you guys, these guys will do anything to help y'all grow better. So, and how many times have we said we need a whiteboard?
I was horrified for a second. I was curious to see what he was going to do over there, but it turned out pretty good.
Wasn't sure it was going to work.
I thought, I didn't know if I needed to get markers or like put some dots on his arms, draw some zigzags.
Gosh. I'm writing this down though. Oh my gosh, great questions coming in, y'all. And thank you for those over on YouTube. I think it's it for now. So I'm going to pass it back to Keisha for our Instagram questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Mandy. Yeah, you just blew my mind. Just wanted to share this comment. Cypher, glad to have you on today. Just wrote, hi, y'all. Sorry I'm late. I'm stuck in trim jail today. We are thinking of you. All right. Next question. Again, on the theme of pH. Let's just go for it. So Pangbrug just wrote in, hey, I'd like to know how the plant would respond to a higher input pH getting to the end of veg, say 6.2 or 6.4 pH. Assuming we've been hardening them off on 600 ppfd light intensity and feeding bloom nutrients prior to flip. Could this help maintain a good pH during stretch without dropping too low? A little insight on pH values for veg and flower would be appreciated. What do you guys think?
Oh, that's definitely a higher pH earlier than I would prefer. Sometimes, once we get towards the end of flower ripening, we'll let that pH climb up a little bit. We want to keep that nitrogen solubility really good when we're coming out of veg and into flower. We still want some explosive growth to get as big a plant as fast as we can. So I would personally keep my pH right in check with the type of media that I'm using at the end of veg.
Yeah, and raising and lowering pH, I'll run down to a 5.5 if my runoff's coming off at like 6.5, and I'll run up to a 6.5 if my runoff's going a little low. And those are absolutely band-aids in the situation. That means I'm trying to adjust that pH to actually bring me in. And really the amount of sulfuric acid I put in there, or phosphoric acid, isn't the actual solution to my nutrition problems. That's just helping me restore the pH. So, and again, it's using a Band-Aid to kind of cover up a wound that's just starting to open up. And usually you want to go back and look at like, do I need to push more runoff? Now, sometimes we'll end up in a situation where I'm not pushing runoff for maybe 3 days. I personally don't like to go out a lot longer than that because I start to lose visibility and you can start to hit some pretty severe pH drops if you go too long. But plenty of people will go up to like a week, maybe a little more with no runoff. And that's where, like early generative, those first 2 weeks, we're really trying to crank up that EC. That's sometimes where, a little bit higher pH input might help out. But again, get in the mindset that anytime you've got to adjust that feed pH outside of, your desired range, we're really band-aiding it. We're not actually solving that ionic concentration problem. Yeah.
And if you're going to be playing with feed pH very much, make sure you are taking runoff readings every day of pH. And if you're at the point where you're trying to do no runoff, I always recommend still to have just enough runoff to take those measurements.
Yeah, I mean, we're using technology to crop steer to a T here. If we go back, one of the first cocoa techs I ever read about, I don't know, over a decade ago now at this point, but the recommendation was like a pretty high perlite mix, some other amendments, so we didn't have to really worry about pHing our tap water. And then some of those early techs kind of came from this bridging the gap between deep water culture and soilless hydroponics. And one of my funniest examples is one of the solutions I heard early on was, we're growing small plants, take your 1 gallon pot and dunk it in a bucket of nutrient solution till it's still at tops bubbling, and then put it back in your tent. And what we were doing there was just basically completely replacing everything in the block every time we watered, which the intent is like, hey, I have pretty ultimate control when I can replace this volume of water this completely and this quickly. It just turns out that that's incredibly inefficient. It even sucks if you're growing in your closet in the room that you live in, because now you've got this whole complicated watering process that's all messy and a pain in the butt. But it's kind of where the strategy comes from. We're taking that same concept where we want to control exactly what's going on. We're just slowing down our ability, or slowing down the rate at which we can affect those changes.
I mean, there's some places that run flood and drain. I just saw a picture in my head of the ways that still works.
Yep, but and as awesome as I love flood and drain, to be honest, like that sounds like a dream to me, to roll benches into a greenhouse and drop some, roll it from zone to zone. It's really easy. Water's going in, it's draining out. I don't have emitters. I don't have all this stuff. But then I also have this huge volume of water that I now have to deal with that's constantly drifting out of my desired range. So if I have 5,000 gallons of recirculating water, and in 7 days, now I'm at half the nutrient capacity that I wanted to be, and my pH is drifting, I've got to do a half dump, a full dump. I've got to deal with all this excess water. And that can get expensive, especially in a city setting, or, if you're a rural greenhouse. That's another thing to keep in mind. Like, at least here in Washington, for instance, the water running off of your property can't be any higher ppms than the water coming out of your well or running onto your property. So there's kind of not just, all of us want to have a little bit cleaner world in terms of the environment, but you've also got to look at what your local regulations allow too. Some systems are very cost prohibitive or just simply not practical in certain situations.
Outstanding, guys. Thank you so much. Alex just posted a little note here, and Alex, you're welcome to unmute yourself if you like. The plant IPM is intense with flood and drain. If one plant's sick, messes up everything. Yeah. So get that.
I'll whine about slabs sometimes when people are having those problems. Like, you lose one, you lose three. But when you go to flood and drain, it's if one's sick, they all are. That's for sure.
Yeah, awesome question and answer. So good luck out there paying buds. And Mandy, we got about 10 minutes left on the show. What's happening on YouTube?
Oh my gosh, breaking news. We posted a poll and we just got the results. Oh my gosh. Thank you guys for voting today. Our question was, what's your favorite phase of growth? So veg, gin, flower, or harvest? And I was kind of surprised by this one. Veg got 43%, gin 0%. What's up with that, y'all? Flower 57%. Okay, I kind of get that. And then harvest is 0%. Is that because of all the extra work? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, got 0 votes because it's the trickiest. Takes the most full feedback of analyzing how they're growing this time and making some irrigation changes.
You asked a bunch of people who are growers, and although they might be smokers, they're not just smokers and not growers. So I think it's definitely hard not to have some sort of passion for the process when you're involved in it, especially if you just enjoy watching plants and things grow. I mean, personally, I love watching the plant throughout like generative stretch. When I'm seeing that plant just take off and new morphology is happening a little bit every week, that's my favorite time. And then really flowering in general, I get to see so much happening with the plant and then see the results of what I'm doing, and one cool thing about cannabis is it doesn't take that terribly long to grow. So every 2 months I get to see what changes I made, what kind of effects they had. Then if you couple that with running a facility that's got 5 or 10 flower rooms, you get a lot of interesting things happening all at once. It can really kind of keep your mind active, and I don't know, it keeps it interesting. That's one thing when we're all doing something super cyclical, right? Like the most you can do to keep your mind engaged, the better. And also then you're putting out a better product. You can have more pride in your craft when you're doing that as well.
I really like, into veg, early flower. It's a time when we get to see all the roots popping out of the bottom, and we get to give that plant sometimes more media. And so, we get to be hands on and get to move them and smell them. The fresh plants, I think, always smell really good.
Oh yeah.
What a bunch of weed nerds on this podcast right now.
Alex had a note here. Gin's most interesting for sure. I love watching that stack happening. Heck yeah. Love that. I think mine wasn't an answer, but it's consuming. But we'll add that next time.
That falls under harvest. I mean, that's a close second for me to flower.
An important part of the process, indeed.
Well, you got to test it. I mean,
Yeah, to know the quality, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're all here for that. We have a couple of minutes left in the show, so I'm going to get to this question from High Cloud Society. Can you give me some best practices for heat when home growing?
As consistent as possible. It can always be kind of tricky when home growing. It just depends on what kind of setup you have. Obviously, if you're in a house, try to have a separate HVAC zone for that area. If you're in a tent or something, try to get a heater, or if you need to get rid of heat, then some type of AC unit in there is going to be helpful. If you're in a greenhouse, sometimes I used to just put 55-gallon barrels full of water because I didn't have heat or electricity in my greenhouses, and so that would absorb the sun's rays throughout the day and had enough mass that it would keep my plants a little bit happier overnight. There's a lot of kind of jerry-rigged ways that you can do it that are low cost.
Oh yeah, I mean, one awesome thing I think about home growing is, if you're home growing for yourself, especially, you're growing your own medicine or just trying to have your own high quality product, we're not necessarily looking at trying to get, 4+ pounds per light. In fact, unless you've invested in CO2, really nice lights, unless you've really gone and built your Ferrari in your basement, you probably don't even expect that without running into some serious problems. But one really cool thing that I like to take advantage of is cannabis, especially really high quality, high terp flower, is expressed very well at about 65 to 74 degrees. So conveniently, that's about where I leave my thermostat in my house. 65 to 70 is where I'm most comfortable. And yeah, I don't get quite as fast a plant growth if I got that heat up. I'm not optimizing everything, but for my situation where I'm trying to grow my own high quality flower and I want it to be grown by me, clean. I know exactly what went into it, and generally better than what I see on the shelf for the average price range. I'm going to do everything I can to try to keep just to keep it simple, set my HVAC for that level. And then if you've got a tent in a big enough room where it's not going to, just heat up only that room, maybe you got to leave the door open. Maybe you got to adjust some central air settings. But I don't know. I think it's wonderful. I've had great times home growing, just not having to mess with it too much as long as I have good air circulation inside of my little grow room. And the other thing too, just think about where you're actually comfortable at. Like if you like your house at 68 degrees, and you might have to get some humidity going early on, but if you like your house at 68 degrees and 45% humidity, man, you're right in that deep purple ripening zone pretty easily there. So that's definitely something to consider. It's a lot less of a challenge for the home grower to push quality than it is to blow it up to a huge industrial scale.
Awesome. Thank you guys for that. And real quick, I have one more question about pH. Should we be upping pH the last few weeks of flower?
I don't mind letting it rise up a little bit just to reduce nitrogen solubility.
Yeah, one thing to watch too is like at the end of flower, you're kind of playing with an interesting pH balance, right? So as the plant enters senescence, we should see it stop uptaking, not completely, but we're going to see a big slowdown on that nutrient uptake. So when you're pushing those big generative drybacks in ripening, a good thing to do is just pay attention to your pH. You might see it coming out a little lower, and then as the plant stops feeding, it stabilizes a little more. It might go from going in at a 5.9 or a 6.0 and coming out at a 5.6 to, we go in at a 5.9 and we come out at a 5.8 to a 5.9 across the board. And what that's going to tell me is I don't really need to pick that up too much. However, if I'm continuing, and it's strain to strain, right? Some strains really do senesce inside of 8 weeks. Some of them we're kind of pushing to mature with that generative growth strategy at the end. So for those ones that are still trying to uptake plants, if I've got a plant that usually I would want to run 10 weeks and I'm trying to harvest in 8 or 9, I might expect that plant to actually continue to have, some dropping pH during my ripening period. And that's where that's a button I want to hit for sure. Raise that pH just a little bit to adjust for what we're doing. Again, that's a little Band-Aid, but that is one of the things you can pull, is adjusting that up to about a 6.5. I would not, though, do it as a rule across all of my cultivars. And as Jason pointed out, though, there are some, with a lot of nutrient lines out there right now, we're staying pretty high nitrogen towards the end. So that's another thing to look at, as we go below 6.0 in the root zone, that's where we see peak nitrogen uptake. And if you're running, calcium nitrate's the most popular nitrogen to put in hydroponics right now. When we're looking at nitrate, the plant can't regulate nitrate uptake nearly as well as it can with pretty much any other plant nutrient. That nitrate is being preferentially uptaken by the plant. So keeping our pH at that 6.0 or slightly above is going to help us out just a little bit. We're going to stay inside of a healthy range, but not quite be it where we're at 5.6, which is like prime, super fast nitrogen uptake.
Wow, is this the pH episode or what? Wow, that just happened organically. We did not plan for this. That is it for the questions on YouTube. Thank you guys for all of those. And thanks for all the shout outs. It's always a great show. Back to you, Keisha. I think we have a couple more minutes left.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy. Yeah, the questions are on fire today. Thank you all so much for submitting those. I have one last question just to close us out from Instagram, and the folks who submitted us questions over there. We will get to them when we can, but you know what? If you're on live, that's your best shot. Okay, Adam wrote in wanting to know, in 45% cocoa, when going from stretch gen to bulk veg, if I'm drawing back too far during P3, is it better to continue P2 shots, size shots, 4% through P3, or begin P1 3% shots at lights on so that by 3 hours, I'm resaturating 20 to 25% to full capacity? Thanks for all the knowledge. You guys get all that?
I
kind of stumbled over it.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
I think we can work with that and generalize. For P1s, typically I'll, try and get up to field capacity within, 1 to 2 hours of my first irrigation. And in general, that first irrigation is going to be 1 to 2 hours after lights on. And so I'm always talking about irrigation window. If my drybacks are too big before the next day's irrigation, I'll just make that irrigation window a little bit wider. That being said, if we're in the wrong size media, we're always going to be struggling because we might have to push too many irrigations to be steering generatively. And, if we're in too large a media, then, a lot of times we're just not going to see the drybacks that we want in order to push vegetatively.
Yeah. I mean, I think a good spot to start, as you mentioned, P1, P2, and then P3. So that tells me, generally we talk about P1 and P2 morning and afternoon irrigations. However, where the whole P thing comes from, program, that's kind of back to old school controllers where you got to run a different program for different settings on your irrigation schedules. So like, for instance, my P1 program 1 might be those 6% shots or 3% reaching field capacity, whereas my program 2 is going to be smaller, 1 to 2% shots in the afternoon. Now, if I want to get real fancy, or if I'm going like, hey, I need to have 4 P1s at a certain size and I want my 5th one to actually be bigger, what that's going to look like programming wise is 4 P1s, 1 P2, and then what we normally call P2s are going to be your P3. Now, when you mention P3, if you're talking about watering past lights off, that's going to be a pretty big sign that you probably have too small of a media. One thing, like Jason mentioned, one thing to remember is that, that dryback is always related to plant and media size. So probably look at, if you're over drying and feeling like you have to go to a P3, say overnight, we would look at to try to stay generative, hitting our P1s in that 1 to 2 hour range, and then not watering until about 1 to 2 hours before lights off, and then bringing it back up the amount we need to correct that so we don't over dry. Not necessarily pushing runoff, but if I was going to dry from 45% down to 15, I need to make sure that I get at least, 5, if not 5% shots on there before the lights turn off. So I'm coming in at a much more reasonable level in the morning. And that's a Band-Aid, but that's the best you can really do in that situation is really create 2 distinct irrigation windows and try to gap out as much as you can between them.
Yeah. Anytime that we have to irrigate outside of the photo period, it either means that we're not getting up to field capacity in the substrate, and or media size needs to be a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Back to the old flood and drain issue. If you've ever tried that, the frequency increases a little bit as those plants get bigger, right? And then finally to the point where you go, okay, we have to have quite a few more even overnight irrigations than we wanted. Okay, maybe we go from a 4-inch to a 6-inch block on this next run, just to try to deal with that, make our system a little bit more efficient. And redundancy is huge. Anytime we're talking about irrigation systems, I can't stress that enough with people. They all fail, especially if not properly maintained. So if you can find a plant and pot size that gives you good controllability, but not so much of a fast dryback rate that you back yourself into a corner and you start having plants drop if you miss 1 P2 in a day because a pump failed or a solenoid failed or emitters plugged up. I really like to keep myself in a zone where I've got, at least 6 to 8 hours of lights on before I'm hitting wilting plants. That gives me enough time to actually fix my irrigation usually. That in most size rooms, excluding some of our more massive greenhouse friends, most indoor grows, if you time it out right, you can have backup parts on hand and build your system. So unless something's inside a wall, you can replace it in a short amount of time. I mean, I go as far as keeping, I have spare irrigation lines around that already have emitters in them. So if my table starts to plug up unpredictably, I go, okay, do I send someone around and have them spend 50 hours in the next 2 weeks popping out emitters and fixing this, or this stuff's cheap? I'm going to rip it out and replace it and not have it interrupt my run.
Wow. Thank you guys so much for that. We had to go over because we're just like sharing knowledge and blowing minds today. Seth and Jason, thank you so much for a great conversation this week. Mandy, thank you for co-moderating with me. And thank you to our producer, Chris, for holding it down behind the scenes. Before we go, if you're looking for any Arroyo gear, Arroyo.shop is now open for business, and we got a new promo. The Arroyo hat trick is in motion. If you put 3 hats in your shopping cart, you're going to watch some magical savings appear. So quantities are limited, and so is this promo. Get your merch before someone else does. All right. Thank you all for joining us for this week's episode of Office Hours. We do this every Thursday, and the best way to get answers from the experts is to join us live. To learn more about Arroyo, book a demo at arroyo.io. One of our experts would be happy to walk you through all the ways it can be used to improve your cultivation production process. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover on Office Hours, post questions anytime in the Arroyo app. Drop your questions in the chat or on YouTube. Send us an email at support.arroyo@metergroup.com. DM us on all the socials. We want to hear from you. We'll send everybody in attendance a link to today's video. It'll also live on the Arroyo YouTube channel. Like, subscribe, and share while you're there. See you at the next session. Thanks, everybody. Bye.